Welcome to Developer Diaries with Ben Wilson in association with the All About Property Facebook group. Hello and welcome to another edition of Developer Diaries with me, Ben Wilson, in association with the All About Property Facebook group. This is the fourth episode of Developer Diaries. It seems to have gone really quickly doing the past three, and now we're on to our fourth one. We've got a really interesting episode for you today. It's going to be quite heavy on the detail. We're going to go really technically into an aspect of residential property that is incredibly important for most people, especially those buying flats. And we are going to be joined by a very experienced solicitor who is not only a solicitor, she's also a specialist leasehold solicitor. She's a partner at a law firm called Streathers LLP, and I will be telling you a little bit more about her later. First of all, though, I will, as I always do, I'll give an update on the property market. It's been an interesting few weeks, safe to say. We've seen an interest rate rise to 4.25%, which was kind of expected. We've also seen issues in the banking system with, we've had Silicon Valley Bank collapse and their UK outfit purchased by HSBC for £1, even though they weren't actually in trouble themselves, just by their very name. They were basically rescued by HSBC, who got a great deal by the looks of it. Obviously, this has had a little bit of impact on confidence. We are seeing that the best stock is still selling. First-time buyers are a little bit more withdrawn in the marketplace, and I think we'll see less transactions with first-time buyers as a result of a little bit of a lack of confidence. One thing that the positive that will come out of these banking issues, and the same with the Credit Suisse situation, is that we should see that rates will start to lower in the second half of the year. From speaking to friends and clients of mine that are interest rate traders in the city, they're all talking about the fact that rates are very near the peak of where they should be. We may see another 0.25% rise in 2 months' time, although that may not now happen. The Bank of England are talking about lowering rates in the longer term, because clearly by keeping raising the rates is putting stress on the banking system. I think they will look to avoid that. One thing we are also seeing as well is that a lot of buyers are now choosing not to do work. They are looking specifically for properties that are done up. Presumably this is because they are having to set aside more money on a monthly basis for their mortgage payments, and therefore not keen to spend 100, 200,000 refurbishing a property. So we are getting a lot of feedback from estate agents that done properties, refurbished properties, are much more popular at the moment than properties that are in poor condition or in average condition. You tend to find that when the market loses a little bit of confidence, you tend to find that all of the sort of average properties in the middle, and then the properties in poor condition, they all tend to sell for poor condition money, and only the very best stock sells for the bigger prices. And I think that's probably what we're seeing. Prices have softened a little bit, certainly a few percent, I think, in the last few weeks. I think we'll probably see that we should see values holding out fairly well now. We've got the spring market coming. We're in March. April, May is historically the best time of year to sell. And I think that will help things. Obviously, good weather always makes property more appealing to buyers. So interesting few months ahead. But I think for now, that's the update. As I say, in the main podcast, we're going to be joined by a solicitor, and she is, as I say, a specialist leasehold solicitor. We're going to talk about all things leasehold, from enfranchisement, lease extensions. We're going to be talking about license to alters, the different types of tenures. It's going to be very, very heavy in the detail, but there's going to be huge amounts of knowledge here given by someone who's an exceptional person in her field. And we are really lucky to be joined by Rebecca Rinn from Streathers LLP. So I've already mentioned in the intro that we're going to be getting quite heavy into the detail of all things leases. I've been a bit of a lease geek my whole property career. Even as an agent, I used to go out of my way to try and learn about them. I think they're fascinating things, and I've always thought that if you understand them, which 99% of people don't, you can monetize them and make good money as a developer out of, playing them how you want to play them for gain. And I've always been surprised by how even conveyancing lawyers and estate agents, but specifically conveyancing lawyers, a lot of conveyancing lawyers don't actually understand them as well as you would think they would, right? And that is why we need a proper leasehold specialist such as yourself.
Thank you very much, Ben.
To go see the wood through the trees.
Yep.
I should say that Becky has spent a lot of time preparing today. So most of my guests, they probably prepare, but I knew Becky, being a lawyer, would come in, and she's beautifully highlighted everything, and it's on point.
Of course.
That's why you're so good as your job as you are, because of that. So let's get straight into it. I mean, I think the first thing we're going to talk about is the types of tenures. Do you want to just explain what a tenure is and the different types?
Absolutely. So the different types of tenures, so you can have the freehold, which I think you've bought a few freeholds in your time, haven't you, Ben?
Yep.
So the freehold is basically what I try to say to clients is it's the main building. So it's everything that comes within the freehold demise. Within that freehold demise, you can then have the leasehold interests. So the leasehold interests are usually the flats that are granted from the freehold. Slightly more complicated, you can then have what's called intermediate landlord titles. So you've got the freehold title that sits as the main title. Then you'll have the intermediate title.
Which is a head lease.
Head lease, yep, same thing. So it sits in between, and then out of the head lease interest, they will then grant the subleases.
Yep.
I would usually say in London, that's pretty normal. Sometimes I can have up to about 3 head lease interests.
Really?
And that can be quite complicated.
My flat has this. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I'll probably come on to that later to talk about why that's quite interesting when you come to doing leasehold enfranchisement in terms of serving notices and making sure you serve all of the relevant landlords.
Sure.
So that's the main structure, but I think it's really important for clients to understand that freehold is separate to leasehold, because I get a lot of clients say to me, do I own the freehold? But my flat lease is a part of the freehold.
Sure.
And I'm like, no, it's just the leasehold interest.
And then you obviously have the share of freehold as well, which is a lot of people wrongly assume that a share of freehold is a separate title. You don't have a lease with it, but you always have to have a lease with a share of the freehold.
Absolutely. So most of the time you'll get a lot of, say there's 4 flats in the building, they will all buy the freehold, and then that's what you would say you have a share in that freehold interest, but you also have your leasehold interest.
Fine.
Yeah.
And my understanding is if there's 4 or more flats, it has to be owned via a corporate structure. Is that correct?
Most of the time,
Most of the time.
I would say a lot of lenders are getting very hot on that. We had one case recently, actually, where the lender said that it had to be in the company or they're not lending against any of the properties. So they were really strict on that.
And the reason for that, I guess, is if you have it owned in... I have, for example, owned flats before where we've owned the share of freehold in our own names.
Yep.
And if there's 3 or 4 of you, normally you all have to agree to get things done. And that is whereas in a company, it's generally, depending on the articles, it's generally 50%
correct
or more, more than 50%.
A majority,
so a majority.
yes, absolutely.
So that's why. So the lender's worried about getting stuck and not being able to get things done. If you're trying to spend 20,000 redoing the roof, and you got one lady or man that's got no money and they don't want to contribute, then it just messes everything up. And just while we're talking about the different types of tenures, it's worth mentioning common hold, because it was a bit of a flash in the pan of the government's attempt at a new tenure, and I think the solicitors all sort of got their backs up and refused to convey the deals that were common hold. Is that correct?
I think what happened is the reforms the reforms have really tried to reform the way leasehold enfranchisement works, and one of their proposals was to bring back in common hold. Unfortunately, with common hold, it was brought in 2002 under the Common Leasehold Reform Act, but what the issues with that is that you had other regulative bodies. You had like the leasehold enfranchisement, scheme that's set up for everybody to extend their leases or to buy the freehold. So unfortunately, it meant that the common hold kind of just got pushed back down. And it wasn't really readily available.
I remember it coming in, actually.
Yeah, do you remember?
Yeah, I remember that there was only, I think at one point there was only 20 buildings in the UK that were common hold. And
absolutely.
I just thought the government really cocked it up, didn't they? I think it didn't really work very well.
People don't really understand it enough, and there's not enough information about it.
Yeah.
But essentially what it is all of the owners in the building having a share in the freehold.
An equal share.
Absolutely. But there's no leases. So they have what's called a document that basically sets out the rules and regulations.
Just a document.
Yeah, it's
they really didn't think much on for something original.
No, absolutely. I think they call it a community statement to
even more boring.
Yeah, even more boring. But that basically says if you can have a pet in the building or whatever the rules and regulations are surrounding how the management will go forward with the common hold.
Interesting. Interesting. And I think a lot of people won't know about common hold, but I remember it coming in as an estate agent and thinking,
and everyone going, "What is it?" Yeah.
I mean, if you go to, so I bought a flat in Barcelona about 7 years ago, and they really have like a common hold situation there where you own your flat. There's no freeholder normally.
Yep.
And you have a share each.
Yeah.
So it's a bit more like that. I mean, it's in between the two. So in terms of a lease, let's go back to the basics. Why do you need to have a lease?
A lease is really important because it demises your flat. I'd say most of the time, a flat demises the internal parts.
Yes.
So if you don't have a lease, then there is no description or...
With the land registry.
Yeah,
registered.
absolutely. It really has a description of what your flat entails.
Fine.
With that lease, you can then go, I mean, you obviously know, Ben, because you do a lot of this, you can then go to extend the lease to make it more valuable. You can then go on to sell that flat, or you can sublet the flat, whatever you want to do. But
If it's allowed in the lease.
If it's allowed in the lease.
Which often it's not. There are quite a lot of London leases that say you can't without freeholder consent. A lot of what we buy, we can't without freeholder consent. There's a lot of restrictions on Airbnb now.
Yep.
Landlords are becoming savvy. New leases, they're putting in minimum 90-day terms, or it has to be, it has to be an AST, short held tenancy contract, to avoid people just putting Airbnb tenants in there having parties and whatever. And I guess the lease is also there to make sure that the tenants are all bound by the covenants within the lease.
Correct.
So you're not having loud parties at midnight.
Yep.
Not too often anyway.
Yeah.
And if you're not allowed dogs in the building, you don't have a 50-kilogram dog barking.
Absolutely. Most of the leases will say that the tenants can enforce those terms against the other tenants in the building if they're not complying with.
And we're going to talk about that more with the Deval case later
absolutely.
on. And then, so in terms of the freeholders get a bad rap. They're always made out to be these rich, greedy landlords. I think, to be fair, in all the stereotypes of property, I think probably freeholders being difficult is probably a fair stereotype. I have to say, I don't know that many altruistic freeholders who are, not in it for the making as much money as possible. Most of them have bought them as long-term investments, and there are...
Agreed.
If you know what you're doing as a freeholder, there are ways to get money out of this, that and the other, whether that be taking a commission from buildings insurance policies. Yep. Often when I go into to buy flats, I find that a building that should be insured for £1 million, that's the rebuild value, not the actual value of the flats. The value of the flats might be 5 million, but the rebuild value is £1 million. They're insuring it for 2.5 million. The policy's like £7,000. They're taking 1,400 of that year on year on year. They also get their own handyman to do work, so adding 20%, 30% to all the costs. That's the unscrupulous landlords. Of course, not all landlords are like that, but I would say that a vast number are, from my experience. And so really, what is their role as freeholder from a legal point of view?
Good question. I would say the main role of a freeholder is to maintain the structural parts of the building. So when we come back to the lease point, leases will have usually demised the internal parts, whereas the freeholder will be responsible for all of the structural parts. That will be the foundations, the roof, the structural, the external walls. So that will be their main purpose, or their main role, is to carry out those landlord obligations within the lease.
By their managing agent normally.
Absolutely. The other role is to collect ground rent, because obviously any ground rent that is under the lease will go to the freeholder, and also to make sure that they've got either managing agents appointed to do the buildings insurance, collect the ground rent, service charge on their behalf, whatever they need to do. So it's really the running and the managing of the building.
Fine. And I mean, we'll talk about the changes in ground rent as well as part of this podcast shortly. So in terms of freeholders, what happens if the freeholder's not there? What happens if you have an absentee freeholder?
It happens to me all the time.
I've dealt with that before.
This is a bit of my specialist area. So I get a lot of clients that say to me, we bought the property with indemnity insurance and we've got a missing landlord. What do we do now? We want to either extend the lease or we want to buy the freehold. So the first thing that I say to the clients is we have to carry out all reasonable attempts to try and find the missing landlord. And they will include different searches.
Is there a number of months, that you have to do it for, or not?
No, so you have to carry out search, and you have to give them reasonable time for any missing landlord to come forward. So I would always say a reasonable time is about 28 days.
Is that all?
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say 12 months.
No. 28 days.
28 days. No. Becky, 28 days, then she's off.
I would say that's
She's
a reasonable time. The judge has also agreed with me on that as well. Once we've collated all of our searches, and let's say we still haven't found the missing freeholder. I think one freeholder that I found was in the Cayman Islands.
Good place to be, isn't it?
But yeah, we managed to track them down. But let's say we don't. You then make the application to the court, and the court will give you what's called a vesting order, and it will allow the tenants to either extend their lease or buy the freehold. And it basically means the pot of money that goes towards buying the freehold or extending the lease will be paid into court.
Which court is it that it goes to?
County court.
It's a county court.
Yeah,
so I thought it might be similar to the Leasehold Valuation Tribunal.
No, it's
separate.
The proper county court you go to. So I just had a hearing last week.
Yeah.
And they pay it into court. Then if the missing landlord, let's say in 5 years' time, comes out of the woodwork or is found, they can then make an application to the court to have that premium paid out.
Am I correct in saying, because I've only dealt, I don't know how many, in terms of being an agent and a developer, I've probably transacted 200 or 300 properties as an agent and probably 50 as a developer, 40 as a developer. So I've done hundreds of transactions or overseen them anyway. And I've only come across absentee freeholders, I think, 2 or 3 times in my whole 19-year career.
Yep.
It's quite rare. I know for you it's not.
No.
But for Joe Blogs, it's quite rare.
Absolutely.
And am I correct in saying that the money for the share of freehold, say the enfranchisement that you do, that would go to the Crown? Is that right?
No, it just stays in court.
It just stays there forever?
Yep. Absolutely.
Someone told me, see, I've learned something today. This is what I mean about leases. Leases are so complex, and
I think what you're saying there is if it's dissolved, then it will go to the Crown.
Okay.
Yeah, but in this case, there's a missing freeholder, so it gets paid into court.
There you go. Okay,
so yeah.
Fine. And then in terms of the leaseholders themselves, so what does the leaseholder actually own?
So what I said earlier, the internal parts. So for example, what you need to make sure is when you're looking at the lease, make sure the description is absolutely clear. So for example, it will say the internal walls. What are those internal walls? Is it any structural walls, or is it just the internal parts of the plaster that's included? And along with a lease, you'll always get a lease plan, and that is absolutely crucial. So it will have, most leases I think have a red edging, and it shows you exactly what's included. So that's what it usually would be.
So we're talking about lease plans. Whenever we buy something, one of the first things I ask for from any estate agent is the lease with the lease plan, because the lease is like the Bible of a property. So whatever is written in that lease is your gospel in that building, and there's very few instances where you can actually go get round it or go against it. I know there are. If it's totally unreasonable, you might be able to argue it, but even then I've had situations where the lease has been so tightly worded that we've either had to get a deed of variation to change it, or we've had to pay money to get that done. When it comes to lease plans, the dream as a developer is just to have a square box with a red line around it with no walls in the middle, because then if you're changing all the walls, and presumably they're not structural, and it doesn't say you can't remove load-bearing walls, you can do what you want, you can change the walls. And whenever I've probably 1 in 10, 1 in 20 properties we buy is like that. Most of them, unfortunately, they have the lease plan exactly as the flat is, and I always think, shit, I wish it was. Wish it wasn't. It makes such a difference. So the lease plan is a really important document. And I mean, one of the questions I was going to ask you, what you can and can't do as a leaseholder, but really I've answered that, which is that whatever is stipulated in the lease,
absolutely,
that binds you by. But often you can't. A lot of leases say that you have to have carpet in flats, which is archaic now because everyone wants wooden flooring. I touch wood, I'm yet to have a deal where they've enforced that. They normally insist on either us. We have to do sound tests sometimes, before and after acoustic tests, about 500 quid each. You go in, you do the sound test before, you can't be in the flat because they do very loud noises. Apparently it could damage your hearing. I think that was all a bit over the top, but apparently that's what they say. Then we lay our floor, we put in really expensive acoustic matting, and then we retest. That's if it's a belts and braces, difficult surveyor for a freeholder. Sometimes they just say, don't worry, stick in what you want. There's no continuity with these things. And one of the hardest things, we'll come on to licence for alterations in a minute, but one of the hardest things in developing is you cannot quantify how long a licence alter will take to do, because there is no statute that governs it. Is that right?
Absolutely.
With everything else there is, pretty much. It really should be reformed, because we've dealt with things recently. We have 8 months on Westbourne Terrace to get a licence, which we're paying £7,000 a month in costs over 8 months. You can work out how much money that cost us just sitting around. I think we'll come on to that more. So let's talk about the types of title. So just explain briefly what title is and the types of title.
So on a leasehold title entry, you'll have what's called title absolute, or you could have good leasehold title. Title absolute is the best title you can get. So it's the highest class of title. And that means that nobody can come along and say that you don't own the property or contest it in any way. So that's what you're looking for, essentially. Good leasehold title means that there's a slight defect in the title, or some documents haven't been uploaded to the land registry, or they haven't had sight of something.
Is that qualified as well? Is that the
Yeah,
same
that's
one?
the same thing. Good
Same
leasehold
thing.
qualified. Yeah, you can.
We're going to give an
either.
example at the end, actually,
Absolutely.
about how we bought something with lots of issues, actually, very short lease and good title. I mean, and Becky's sorted it all out for us. Actually, on Friday we completed on the lease extension, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So, are there any other types, or just those two?
And qualified title, but that's not very common, because that's when it's got a real defect. But you don't really come across those.
Yeah.
You'd come across good leasehold title,
Yeah.
but I would say majority of the time it is title absolute, which is the best title you can get.
Fine. It's,
Yeah.
you think that the land registry, being quite cantankerous sometimes, you think that they would reject a qualified title registration and just say, sorry, it's not good enough, we need more info.
Yeah, they don't, because, you know, if it needs to be registered, they'll register it. But I don't think you can make an application after the 12 months. So if it's registered as good leasehold title, you can't upgrade it until 12 months later.
Right.
And I think that maybe gives people to contest it, come forward. It gives everybody an opportunity. But after the 12 months, you can then upgrade it, like we did on your one.
Yeah, fine. But that wasn't after 12 months?
No, that wasn't. But before it was.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
it's changed.
No. So you bought the property, but I think it was
Right.
good leasehold title when you were
Yeah.
buying the property. So it was upgraded, I think, just before.
I
you
see,
then-
okay.
So as long as it's been 12 months, then that should be fine.
Fine. And intermediate titles, competent landlord? I don't. I actually
Yeah.
don't know what that means. I have a rough idea, but I think Becky needs to explain this one.
Yeah, so going back to the title structure, I said you can have the freehold title, intermediate landlords, you can have 1, 2, you can have as many intermediate titles as you like. The ideal situation is having freehold and leasehold. If you do have intermediate landlord titles, from my point of view, because I do lease extensions, that's my main area of work, I need to know who's called the competent landlord.
Right.
And that basically means that they have sufficient reversion to grant a new lease. So let's say you've got the freeholder, then an intermediate
we had
landlord.
this, didn't we?
Exactly, that's
Yeah.
got, say, a 150-year lease.
Yeah.
Then you've got the underlease, 150-year lease less 7 days. Well, they won't have the reversion to grant a new 90-year lease if it runs from,
Because
say...
the other one is a longer lease.
Absolutely.
So if I remember we'll talk about it later, but when we did our lease extension on Hamilton Terrace, a project we're doing, I think when they were splitting the money, it was a very large lease extension premium. I'll go into it later, but
Yeah.
the freeholder, which was a charity, they got something like 95% of the money,
Correct.
if not more.
Yeah.
But of course, the other smaller people, the smaller proportion, not smaller people, they can still make your life quite difficult, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's the problem with it.
They do, because they can be what's called legally represented. So they can serve you with a notice of separate legal representation, which basically means they've got their own set of solicitors instructed.
Which you pay for.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and their own surveyor. So
Yeah.
it basically means there's another level of complexity when it comes to agreeing
Yeah.
the premium and agreing the terms of the lease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. I mean, generally, whenever you're doing these things, you tend to, as the leaseholder, pay for everything. When we were talking about freeholders earlier, and Becky was saying they have an obligation to repair the roof and so on and so forth, that obligation is theirs, but then they recover those costs via the service charge. So they never actually pay for anything, really. And it's becoming less and less compelling to be a freeholder now. Really, other than lease extensions and enfranchisements where people are buying the freehold, it's really people buying areas of demise or communal space that weren't theirs, that they're trying to pay a premium for, so which we'll talk about in a bit. So let's talk about lease extensions. Lease extensions have always fascinated me. They're bloody complex, and I think even it's a bit like if you ask a lot of people the offside rule in football, most people can't explain it. Most people in property can't explain lease extensions. People think that they understand it, but honestly, if you ask them about things, they would probably not be able to tell you. I have always found them fascinating, as I say, and I think I've never really understood why the government or the authorities don't tell people about how critical marriage value is when a lease drops below 80 years. There are so many people that own leasehold flats, especially a lot of the 80s built flats or 90s built that are now 80, 85 years. If people wait, 1 year from 81 years to 79 years and 11 months, they could suddenly get a bill for 10, 20, 30 grand more. They had no idea. And whenever I speak to friends about lease extensions, all I tell them is just get it done as soon as possible, especially if you've got a lease that's below 80 years. Every year, you're going to be paying thousands of pounds more. And if you've got a £5 million flat, you might be paying 20, 30, 40 grand a year more.
Absolutely.
So what's the difference between voluntary and statutory lease extension?
So a voluntary lease extension will basically mean you approaching your landlord and saying, I'd like to extend my lease, how much it's going to cost me. The terms of the leases that they can come back with most of the time, in my experience, are pretty unfavourable because there's nothing governing them. You know, it's a voluntary lease extension. We can basically say whatever we like. So I always say to clients, if you want to approach your freeholder in the first instance, then do. You never know. Let's see what the terms are. Let's
might get a nice
put it
one
on the table. Exactly. You might want to. And I would say with the voluntary lease extensions, it can work in your favour sometimes because it can be quicker. You know, you could hopefully wrap it up within a month.
So go on, sorry. Go on.
If you are up against a landlord that's not given you very good favourable terms for a voluntary lease extension, then my advice would go down the statutory route.
Which you can only do if you've lived there 2 years.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
So the statutory route is very strict. You must have owned the flat for 2 years prior to making your application.
They should get rid of that.
They are, which we'll come on to with the reforms. And the lease extension will be extended for 90 years on top of the existing term.
Yeah.
And the terms of the lease, most crucial, must be on the same terms as the existing lease, which is good if, you know, you've got a landlord who wants to impose an interest clause or whatever they want to propose.
Sorry, I was just going to say that what you say about having them on the same terms, that's important because what a lot of smart big freeholders do, multi-millionaire freeholders who've got thousands of freeholds, they would have in the past used a lease extension as a way to screw down the lease even tighter.
Absolutely.
To say, right, there's an absolute prohibition on any works to the flat. You can't have a dog. Any way that they could catch tenants out to screw them right down in that lease, they would. And the reason why the government have said that is to protect tenants, so that tenants, if they've got a very relaxed lease, it says you can have, you know, an Alsatian and, you know, have parties till 4 a.m. every day, which I don't think any lease ever says. But then they could just carry on having their parties with their new lease as well.
Absolutely.
Good. So I think, we're mentioning about the lease extension. I think obviously everything goes down to the ground rent will go down to a peppercorn ground rent whenever you extend a lease. That's always the case, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And a peppercorn is literally, where does that come from?
It's just a terminology that's been used, but you know, you can actually go to a tenant and
you can demand a peppercorn.
Yes, absolutely. That's why that they usually always put in brackets. You'll see in most leases if demanded, because
I've never had a landlord ask me
that.
For a peppercorn. No. I probably wonder what he was asking me.
I don't think anyone has really. I think there was a lease going back a long time ago that said you had to pay by one rose.
One rose.
Was,
that's quite nice. It's quite romantic.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
it was
thought
a lease
that was quite nice.
drafted on February 14th.
That was quite nice. Yeah, exactly.
And so statutory lease extension. So we were saying that you have to live there. There's certain criteria to be able to extend the lease. One of them is that you've got to live there 2 years.
Correct.
Another one is that there can't be. What's the percentage of maximum of commercial property that can be in the building?
25%. But that's if you want to buy the freehold.
That's only the freehold. So that doesn't count for leases because
it doesn't buy. No,
there you go.
It's just the statutory lease extension.
And then is it a minimum lease term of 8 years?
No, 21.
21. I've been wrong on everything today, so it's good to be schooled.
You can extend the lease at any point, but the original term must have been over 21
it's
years.
Over 20. So even in year one, you can do it.
As long as the original lease was granted for over 21 years, then you can extend the lease.
This is what I mean. This is such a big subject that
it is
that you're always learning on it, which is good. And then you've mentioned about the Leasehold Reform Urban Development Act 1993, which sounds incredibly exciting. Why don't you tell us about it?
So this is the act in place that allows you to do a statutory lease extension.
Right, got you.
So this is the act that governs how you can extend your lease once you've owned your flat for 2 years and you have all the other requirements met and satisfied.
Right.
And that is, I would say, it is a very complicated act. But once you understand it and know it, it's, you know...
You enjoy it?
I do enjoy it, I do.
Becky's actually quite fun on a night out. I know you may not think that she is, but she, your solicitor persona and your out of work persona,
very different.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously, you're very knowledgeable in all these things. So, in terms of the role of a surveyor in a lease extension, what's their role?
So before I would take on a client, I'd always say to them, sign you up, but the first thing you need to do is find out how much it's going to cost you. Yeah. And invariably, that's the first question clients say to me, how much is it going to cost? I've got your legal cost, but how much is it actually going to cost to extend the lease or buy the freehold?
Yeah.
They've got to take proper valuation advice and they've got to do it with a surveyor that knows the 1993 Act, because that is a very specialist valuation.
Fine, yeah.
Their role is, I'm not a surveyor, so I won't go too much into the calculations, But certainly, like what you said before, Ben, if the lease is under 80 years, you have to pay what's called marriage value.
Yeah.
And that basically, in a nutshell...
This is crucial for everyone listening. So everyone listen to this bit.
It's absolutely crucial that if a lease drops below 80 years, it's basically a diminishing asset.
Yeah.
So if it does drop, you have to pay additional compensation to your landlord, what's called marriage value. And that can be very expensive, very expensive.
And am I correct in saying the marriage value is 50% of the uplifting value brought about by the lease extension?
Yes,
is that right?
so it's the combined value of the freehold and lease extension currently, and then once you've extended it,
and they
and
get
then
50%,
it's the 50%.
and that's because they own the land and the exterior walls.
Yeah.
So they're a party to that, basically, that uplift.
Absolutely.
Fine. So that's key. And just to be sort of clear, in terms of, say you had a flat that was worth 500 grand with an 81-year lease, and obviously if you're buying it currently with an 81-year lease, you've got to be there 2 years. It's going to be 79 by the time you can extend it until they change that.
Yeah.
So, you've got to be clear that if your lease is less than 82 years, you may well be forced to pay the higher lease extension. And it could also, say your lease extension was 10,000 above 80 years as a ballpark, and let's say it drops straight away to 2025 under 80. When it's 70, it might be 40 or 50. When it's 60, It could be 100. It could go up to 200,000-300,000 if it's down in the 30s to 20s. I mean, it's a massive difference that it makes.
Yeah, so I had a client that came to me with 1 year remaining on their lease. So basically, it was a very nice property in a very nice area. They basically had to, I can't say.
You can't say, so I don't get in trouble.
Basically, the property, you had to repay the whole value of the whole property again, because it was basically such a diminished asset that they had no value in them. And by the time we did extend the lease had actually already run out. But obviously, because you're in the statutory process, you're protected. So they actually paid the whole property value again.
I mean, we've just done a 28-year lease purchase and an extension, which we'll talk about in a minute. We will buy very short leases. We buy something with a 10-year lease, 15-year lease. But what's difficult from a development point of view, when you're sometimes areas like Knightsbridge, South Kensington, the more prime parts of London, you can get in most parts of London, for mortgages less than 70 years, most lenders aren't interested in lending to you. Some it will be 25 years at the end of the term. So if you've got a 25-year mortgage and it's got 51 years on the lease, they'll consider it sometimes. Correct. But in the more prime parts of London, lenders generally will lend on 20, 30, 40-year leases because the properties are so valuable, they have an intrinsic value, and it's kind of the norm. You go to places like Hans Crescent in Knightsbridge, they've got these amazing red brick houses, they've all got really short leases. But one thing that I find hard when I'm trying to value places to buy with a short lease, I work on the long lease value and work backwards. When the lease is that short, you're almost valuing it based on the rental, what it would cost to rent that flat for 10 years, and it's very difficult to quantify. Obviously, there's a little bit of an uplift on top of that, but so that's something that I've always found interesting. So we've talked about marriage value, time frames. Yeah,
I would say time frames. So if you wanted to do a voluntary lease extension, as I said, you can enter into whatever terms you like with your freeholder. So you could probably, on average, you can probably complete a voluntary lease extension between 1 and 2 months. If you're going down the statutory route, there is a process. So just in a nutshell, once you served it's called a Section 42 notice on your landlord, you put in there a very low price to open up negotiations.
But it has to be realistic, right?
It has to be realistic.
Otherwise they can reject it.
Absolutely. Or the notice will be invalid. Or the notice will be invalid. So once you've served your notice, the landlord then has 2 months to come back with their counter notice. And then after that, there is a period of 6 months for the surveyors to negotiate. And obviously
it doesn't normally take that long, does it?
It doesn't, but if you've got a big premium like your premium, it can take you right up to the 6 months.
And I think something to note about Section 42 notices, because this is something I learned about when I was a very young agent, and actually Section 42s are really useful because when you're buying a property with a short lease, you can get the existing seller who's already lived there for 2 years or more. They can serve the Section 42 in between exchange and completion. You can actually exchange without it being served, which I didn't know until a few years ago. And so the seller, so Mrs. Smith that I'm buying from, I say, I want the lease 50 years, I want it to be a longer lease. You can actually get her to serve the notice in between exchange and completion. That starts the process. You're then within the statute, is that what you would call it?
So they would assign the benefit over to the new buyer. Absolutely, deed of assignment.
That's what I wanted to say. And then so you can then crack on and extend the lease straight away. And you could actually, if you had a long enough completion, you could actually, well, we'll talk about it at the end, but you can actually line up your finance to fall into place.
Correct.
Simultaneously with the purchase of the lease. So I've mentioned it, so we may as well talk about it. So a lot of the reason why people don't extend leases is obviously the cash requirement.
Yeah.
A lot of if you went to a lender and said, I'm going to buy the house, I want 80% of the purchase price, and then I want another 100 grand to do the lease, they'd be like, look, mate, we're not going to lend that to you. It doesn't work like that. But if you give them the long lease value, and then you exchange with a delayed completion, and you simultaneously complete on the lease and the drawdown of the mortgage at the long lease value, you can do it simultaneously, and then they are paying out 80% of the long lease value of the house.
Correct. Absolutely.
Which is very smart.
Yeah. You just need to make sure that you are, I mean, ideally dealing with colleagues in the same solicitor's firm. If you're dealing with other solicitors, that adds another layer of complexities, which makes it harder.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with somebody in your same firm, that's great. The lender will probably have lots of...
well, they want it wrapped up tightly.
They do.
Because they do not want to complete on a 50-year lease.
They want everything. So invariably, they will obviously say to us, we will then do the registration of the lease. They like to take control of all of that part just to make sure that their security is fully protected. Yeah. But you can absolutely do it. I mean, I have some clients that come to me and say, we can't afford it, so we're going to get bridging finance. I mean, bridging finance can be very expensive.
Tell me about it. I take it every month.
Exactly. But in order to get the transaction over the line, because obviously with the statutory lease extensions, it can take up to 9 months, if not a year, sometimes even longer to complete. If clients don't have their funds in order, then you can be up against the statutory time frame. And if you're up against it, then you will need to get the funds in place. Otherwise, the claim can be withdrawn, or you have to make applications to the court to protect the claim. Yeah. So it can.
If you can do it, it's very smart.
Absolutely.
We're giving away our secrets here.
Yes.
Because most people, I think, just see a short lease and think, "Oh my god, I can't buy that."
Or
it's not the case.
You sell the property on and then let the new buyer take that problem on.
Well, most sellers tend to say, most sellers who, if someone hasn't been clued up enough to extend their lease, or they haven't got the money to extend their lease, often they will just they won't care necessarily about doing the lease. They'll just be like, I just want to get rid of it. And even if you say to them, well, look, you could get an extra 20 or 30 grand for your flat, or 50 grand if you sell it with the process moving, because we can sell it as a long lease value flat. We can say that the seller will include this in the sale or whatever. Often people are like, I can't be bothered, and they actually lose out, and the buyer benefits. I always look at lease extensions as very similar to doing a kitchen refurbishment or bathroom refurbishment. It is a way to make your property more appealing to more people. Absolutely. Demand equals more money equals higher sale price. And I've always looked at it like that. It's like refurbishing the flat, doing a lease extension. They're the same thing, just different mechanisms for generating extra value. Yeah. That's how I've always seen them. So let's talk about the different constituents of what makes up the cost in a lease extension. So I guess first one would be ground rent.
Absolutely.
Contentious at the moment.
What you're essentially doing is you're paying the landlord back for the loss of ground rent that they would have received if you carried on your lease without extending it.
So if it's 50 years... At £100 a year,
then you'll be adding up all of those ground rents over 50 years, and then that's the sum that you'll be paying back to the landlord. So any loss of ground rent that they would receive under the lease,
so it'd be 50 times 100.
Because obviously, as we discussed earlier, once you've extended your lease, it then goes to nil ground rent. So they need to be compensated.
So they get that.
Absolutely.
What else do they get?
The other thing would be marriage value, which we've talked about. So it goes as soon as the lease drops below 80 years, they have to pay that additional value.
Try and avoid that if you can, as we've said.
Absolutely.
And then reversionary.
And the reversionary. So that will just be the value in the property that's left. So how many years are left remaining, and then that value will be obviously calculated.
And it's really complicated, the calculation.
It is.
I've seen the pages. When I looked at the lease extension for Hamilton Terrace that we did, it was like 3 pages long. Just like spreadsheet. I mean, I quite like a spreadsheet. I'm a bit of a gimp when it comes to spreadsheet. Gimp's probably the wrong word, but I'll leave that in. Geek. I'm a bit of a geek. I'm not a gimp. It's like page after page of calculations. Have I gone red? And it's quite complicated, but it was quite fascinating as well. But you can see why you pay the surveyors like £2,000-4,000 because it must be so boring to do these calculations.
And then there's also case law that surrounds it as well. So it's not as simple as just taking a lease, valuing it. You've also got to look at if there's any restrictions in the lease as well. Does that have an impact? Lots of
condition.
Different things. Yeah, and also if you're buying the freehold, there could be what's called hope value. So I won't go into that because obviously I'm not a surveyor. And development value as well. Is there any development value?
Well, this is the problem that we had.
The freeholder wants to retain or have a value attached to it. So how do you calculate development value? It's impossible.
Well, we had this with Hamilton, and obviously we bought the flat as it was. I'll talk about it in detail later, but we bought it with a very short lease, and it needed lots of work. The lady had passed away. It was a probate being sold by the estate, her son, and they were arguing about the fact that we were going to bring about a large uplift in value in the flat, which of course we were, hopefully. So I can say that now that we've completed on it. But we were arguing about that, and that's a good example, I think, of what you were saying. And we've already talked about financing it by simultaneously completing. So let's say that now you're trying it. The freeholder wants 100 grand. Your surveyor's told you to offer 60. You've offered 80 after a while. Can't agree it. What happens then?
So what would happen is we would then suggest to the client to make an application to tribunal. And that's absolutely crucial because you have that statutory time frame. You've got to have agreed the premium and the terms of the lease by that 6 months. And if you haven't, then the claim will be withdrawn. So you've got to make what's called a protective applications tribunal to make sure it's protected. The tribunal usually, I mean, I'd say on most of my cases at the moment, they're holding all of the cases in abeyance for 3 months. So tribunal
to try
directions.
And mediate, is that why?
Yeah, so tribunal directions just won't be issued. I think they've got a big backlog. I'm not entirely sure.
Every court has, I think, apparently.
They started doing it in COVID times, but they used to ask the parties whether or not you wanted the tribunal directions issued immediately or held in abeyance. But now every single tribunal application is held in
and it's called the first tier tribunal.
First tier
also
tribunal.
known as the leasehold valuation tribunal. Is that the same thing?
Yes,
they've changed the name.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. LVT,
LVT.
But now it's the FTT.
And the important thing at that point is that up until that point, the leaseholder is responsible for all costs.
Yes.
Yeah, and this should be the same if we'll talk about freehold in a minute, but if buying the share of freehold, at that point, the landlord becomes responsible for his own costs.
Correct.
So it's a disincentive to stop them taking it that far.
Absolutely.
And I think actually, like when we negotiated on Hamilton, we were about 25,000 apart. It was a very large lease extension premium. And I think it would have cost them 20, 30 grand to go probably with legal fees and surveyor's fees. And in the end, we just said, look, let's split the difference and let's agree it. So that it kind of worked for us.
I would say also tactically you can use the first tier tribunal.
We did, I think.
Yeah, you definitely can use it, a bit of tactics, because what the tribunal will do is issue their directions, and then you've probably got another 3 to 4 months until it actually goes to a hearing.
Yeah.
But what the directions do is basically narrow the issues in dispute, so it helps both parties to try and come together to try and narrow those issues and trying to agree the premium or lease terms, whatever's in dispute. But you can definitely use it as a bit of a tactic if you need to get the surveyor or the solicitor.
Okay, and what's the vesting order?
So a vesting order, so once you've done that, you'll then agree the terms, and what the legal term is, terms of acquisition have been agreed once the premium...
This is in the
within the 6
tribunal.
months. Yeah, either at the tribunal, the terms will be agreed, or if you don't end up going to tribunal hearing, like in your case, we managed to agree it between ourselves, then that will be terms of acquisition agreed, and that date stamp will then have an impact going forward. You then have 2 months to complete the lease. And if you don't complete it within 2 months, then you have a further 2 months for either party to make an application.
And what if the landlord doesn't?
Then you make an application to the vesting order. So if the landlord doesn't complete,
that makes sense, yeah.
Then you make an application. So this time you don't go to the tribunal, you go to the county court. And you go to the county court and ask them for an order to say that we must complete by whatever date.
And how can you use these delays, if you like, under statute to your advantage if you need funds?
So I have clients that come to me and say, we need bridging finance, or what we're trying to do is flip the property or sell it. So what we want to do is we don't really want to have the burden of paying for the lease extension. So one case that I'm doing at the moment, they're trying to desperately find a buyer. So we're trying to delay the process as much as possible. And what that basically means is delay within the 6 months to try and agree the premium and the lease. I'm basically just delaying that process as much as possible and not agreeing that until the deadline comes up. Then we can further extend it by making an application to tribunal, which gives us another further month, 4 months, and then you can
so you try and complete on the sale with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because one thing we found is the other benefit is you save on stamp duty by doing that. Yep. So when we completed on our lease extension on Hamilton, we had to pay, I think, £70,000 stamp duty bill. Now, do you know what? I should have checked, but we just paid it. But is that is that classed as a separate transaction from a stamp duty point of view?
Correct.
It is. So there's there is a big benefit then, because stamp duty goes up incrementally over, I think it was over a couple of million, you're paying 10%.
Yeah.
So that extra, in our case, almost £1 million our lease extension was. We would have paid 100,000 in stamp duty, but because it was separate, we paid about 60, I think. So there's a 40 grand saving there.
So you're paying the stamp duty for the purchase price, so whatever the purchase price was at the time, and then when you come to extend your lease, it's almost like you're buying another parcel of land or another property. So it's completely separate.
See, these are all things that save a lot of money. That's 40 grand saved, and I think one thing to say about lease extensions is, like I say about it's like doing a kitchen up. If you do your kitchen up, you spend 50 grand on an amazing kitchen in a £1 million house. It's probably going to add 200 grand to the value of the house. Yeah. Leases won't add that much necessarily proportionally, but they will still add. Generally, if you spent 100,000 on a lease, you'd expect probably to sell it the house for a couple of hundred grand more. Yeah. It's not an exact science, but it's very rare that you would pay for a lease and then not make that money back and quite a nice profit on the top.
Absolutely.
Because you're opening up the market to buyers who, a lot of people are scared of leases, and there's a lot of ignorance around leases in terms of a lot of people think that if it's under 100 years it's a short lease, if it's under 125 it's a short lease. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of rubbish around it, and I think the other thing is, in London there's a lot of buyers that are not UK based, and they don't have leases in Italy and in Spain. So it's a very weird concept to people that haven't grown up in the UK to understand that, well, it's your flat, but it's kind of not your flat. Yeah. And a lot of, when I was an agent, a lot of the buyers who are from Europe, for example, they would just find it such a weird such a weird sort of setup that we have. And so a lot of them would say, oh, well, I want share of freehold only. And you'd have to sort of educate them and say, look, we'll try and get you share of freehold, but actually if a building's badly run as a share of freehold building, it can actually be worse than having a normal leasehold building, because you can't get anything done.
Absolutely.
So that brings me nicely on to freehold acquisition, enfranchisement. Yeah. Nice French word, I presume. Yeah.
So I would say it's actually becoming more and more common for people to buy the freeholds now. I think people are just getting fed up with the management of the building. If you've got poor management, or if they just want more control over how the building is run and managed. I get quite a lot of inquiries and a lot of clients come to me to say, we're just fed up now, we just want to buy the freehold. It also, I would say, I think there's a lot of development going on at the moment, and I think it gives the leaseholders the free rein, or when I say free rein, slightly more limited, to do what they want to do with the property. So if they're basically in business with their neighbours and they've all bought the freehold, it allows Mr. Smith down below to extend out, Mrs. Smith at the top to put a roof terrace, whatever they want to do, they can all come together round the table and agree whatever they like within reason, without having the constraints and restrictions of a freeholder.
And and in terms of cost difference, there's not much difference, is there, between the freehold purchase and the lease extension?
I wouldn't say there's much difference,
so
because you're still, let's say 3 flats want to extend their leases, they will all have their individual values attached to their leases. Yeah. If you're then buying the freehold, those 3 individual values will still be involved for the freehold. The only thing that I would say is if there's any communal grounds or any development value or hope value, that's when it might be a little bit more. If there's vaults, underground vaults that are communal. Yeah. But most of the time, I would say, if you're going to think about extending your lease and your other flat tenants are interested, then it might be worth buying the freehold when you've got the full reign.
And the other thing is, say you've got a building you've got a ground floor flat with vault, or let's say a lower ground floor flat with vaults under the pavement. You've got a raised ground, then a first floor with a loft above it. If you buy the freehold, you can then when you redraft the leases, perhaps, or you change the clauses by deed of variation, whatever you do, you probably redraft them. But you can then say that the lower ground floor flat has the right to extend into the vaults without premium. The upper floor flat has the loft space, it's owned by them, because in most buildings, people assume the loft space above a flat would be owned by them. In 9 out of 10 cases, it's not. It's owned by the freeholder. Then you can say, oh, I want to do a 100 grand loft conversion that's going to add $250,000 to the value in a nice part of London. The freeholder goes, yeah, great. If they know what they're doing, they go, great, yeah, well, we want 40% of the uplift. And we're like, well, hang on a minute. Well, but they get away with it. So if you buy the freehold, you can make those changes. You can extend your leases to 999 years.
Yep,
so you've
correct.
The longest, you can't go above that, can you?
No, yeah,
you can technically.
but
it's 9,000. I mean, we're not going to be around.
It's not a thing that
years,
anybody does. It's just the standard 999.
Yeah, I've never seen one longer than that. I have heard of it longer, but
you just wouldn't. It's just 999 year lease is absolutely fine if you've got a share in the freehold.
Yeah, we're not going to be, unless you're cryogenically frozen. We're not going to be around that in that amount of time. And what's the minimum percentage you need to do it, to buy the freehold?
So you would need. So first of all, if there's commercial element,
we talked about this earlier.
Yeah, we need to make sure that that's under the 25%.
That's caught me out a number of times.
Absolutely. So if that's over the 25%, then the building won't qualify.
Do you think that will change?
It will do. We'll come on to that.
Oh, good. This is going to benefit me. I'm glad to hear that.
We'll come on to the reforms.
Good.
And then you need 50% of the flats in the building to participate in
50 or over 50?
50. So if there's four flats, for example, then 2 flats must participate. But you must have qualifying tenants in the building. So you must have at least 2 flats that are qualifying tenants in the building.
Okay.
So then they can obviously clump together or collectively come together to buy the freehold.
Yeah, and we've already talked about the difference between owning it in a company and owning it in your own names. Most freeholds, as we say, are owned by, you have one Smith Road Limited with 4 shareholders, not necessarily 4 directors, but you normally have a certain number of directors. The fewer directors, the better. Normally 3 is probably great. We've got a building at the moment where we have, I think, 12 directors, and it's a bit of a nightmare because everyone's always squabbling over what they want. I mean, and then everyone wants to be in control. And they're asking me to become a director now, and I don't really want another directorship, but I'm going to have to become one, I think, because it's. I
think also in cases like that, as long as you've got good company solicitors and they've made sure that the articles of association are clearly drafted and clearly written, that, for example, when you come to sell your property, you also sell a share of the freehold. If you can iron out details like that, then that really does help.
Can you keep a share of the freehold if you don't? If you sell the leasehold?
It depends what it says in the articles.
That would be weird, wouldn't it?
So when we draft the articles for our clients, we've got a separate company department. They will obviously do the drafting of the articles. We always put in there that they will sell the share of the freehold when they come and sell their flat. It just makes sense for the running management of the building. And
something that you sometimes see, especially with developers selling flats, is they will put an overage clause, so that if they sell out of that building in the future, there's any development that takes place on that land, they're entitled to whatever that percentage is. So if they build a £10 million house on the land and they make £2 million profit, and they had a quarter of that freehold and they get 25%, they get 250,000. A bit of quick maths there for you. And hopefully it's not wrong. I was looking at the right tit. And I always think that's quite clever when developers do that. But obviously a good conveyancing system of the buyer is going to go, hang on a minute.
What's this?
And you go, well, listen, I'm only selling you the flat, There's no development potential at the moment.
Yeah.
So okay, fine. And we don't need to go too deep into the process of freehold acquisition, but I think it's a similar sort of arduous process to extending a lease. No, it takes 3 to 6 months normally. Yeah,
longer than that.
Yeah. No, you've done one for me, actually.
Yes, I have indeed. I would say 9 to 12 months again.
Yeah,
we're looking. It's it can be a very lengthy process, and especially when you've got lots of leaseholders. If you've got, I think one of them I'm doing at the moment, I've got 12 leaseholders, and they all want to email me separately or have their different comments.
Don't you like that, no? Given your WhatsApp,
it's not that I don't like it. It just causes an admin nightmare. So what I would usually say in situations like that is one person will be appointed.
Spokesman.
Absolutely. And so we would do a participation agreement, and I will say, for example, Ben, you are going to be the main person in control.
Lucky you.
All the decisions all go via you, and then that will come to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right, something that's the bane of my life in property development, because I would say 9 out of 10 properties that we develop are leasehold properties, whether they be leasehold with a share of freehold or just plain old leasehold.
Yep.
License to alters, license for alteration, whatever you want to call them. I have noticed in the last year to 2 years, the speed at which they're done has deteriorated massively. I think that surveyors are absolutely snowed under with work. There's no incentive for surveyors to move quickly because they're getting paid their $2 or $3 grand regardless of how long it takes. If it takes longer, they often charge you more as well. Obviously, not all surveyors are like that. We've had a real differing across, say, I've probably done 10 licensed alters over the last 18 months, most for our own development purchase, but a number for clients in our design and build practice. The quickest ones are like 2 to 4 weeks. The worst ones have been like 8 months. I would say an average is like 4 or 5 months. And now whenever we buy something, we always have a minimum of 1 month delayed exchange and completion to try and get... The problem is you can't really start the license process when you've exchanged. If you get a nice managing agent, they may move things along a little bit for you, but officially they can't do anything. And that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I've spoken to managing agents in between exchange and completion, just asked them for like what's their standard set of requirements. So that's how I normally get things moving. Some will just say, sorry, you don't own the property. So then you have to go to the seller and go, can you ask for it? Or sometimes we put it in the exchange contract that they need to ask them for the information we need, which helps. But licensed alters are something that have cost, I reckon delays in licensed alters cost our development business anywhere between 100 and 300,000 a year in extra development finance costs. I mean, it is a staggering amount of money. And it's very frustrating.
I think really the problem with licensed alterations, I get clients that come to me all the time and say, oh, I want to knock that wall down. I want to make a lovely big living room, dining room, whatever they want. And they think it's just a simple knock that wall down. Unfortunately...
Is it not?
What I have to explain to clients, it doesn't work like that. So stripping it right back, if you're having a look at the description of the lease, remember I said to you it's all the internal parts. If the internal parts just include the plaster work of that internal wall, it means you don't actually own that wall. You only own the external plaster.
Yeah.
So by them knocking through that, and depending what the lease says, you've then got to look at the lease and coupled with the lease and what the description of the property is. If it doesn't allow alterations, then
you're in breach of the lease.
You are in breach of the lease. And I don't know if you're aware, Ben, there's a big case called the Duval case.
Which I know all about it. And it was in Randolph Crescent in Maida Vale, which is my stomping ground where our office is.
Absolutely. So interesting, with the decision on that, basically that was an absolute prohibition. That basically means you cannot do structural alterations or whatever the alterations this client wanted to do, you cannot do them to the lease.
I think it was a raised ground floor flat.
And they wanted to go down the basement, correct.
I thought it was the basement flat owner was the one complaining. Maybe, I don't know.
I think they wanted, that was it, they wanted to carry out works. And then the basement flat...
Or the one above complained. So I think the raised ground floor complained. The lower ground floor wanted to dig down and also put in RSJs that would have structurally affected the flat.
And I think the problem with that case is that if you look at the terms of the leases, it says that the landlord grants the leases on all the same terms.
Yeah.
So, for example, the alterations clauses must be the same throughout.
Yeah.
If there is an implied covenant that the landlord has to grant all the leases on the same terms, and there's a mutual enforceability clause to say that the other tenants can bring an action, and the landlord has allowed that tenant to carry out those works in breach of their lease, then the landlord is in breach of their implied covenants for allowing them to do that.
Excuse me.
So that is what essentially the Duval case is all about. So the other leaseholders can come together and bring an action against the landlord. We've come up with a lot of these now. We've got one at the moment, as you know. Yes.
I've had at least 3 or 4 maybe now in the last few years that have been Duval related leases, and we've managed to get around them either through, I'm not going to say how we get around them because not that it's in any way dodgy, but I just don't want. I've got ones at the moment, so I don't want to mention what sometimes we've had to do because I put myself on the back foot. But
it's made landlords really jumpy about it. That they're not. Whereas before they'd probably charge you a premium, say, you can knock that wall down. It's not part of your, but offer us a premium and you can do that. But now they won't even do that because it's not worth that premium. Say £10,000 they're going to charge. It's not worth that premium if they've then got an action against them.
So you have to get everyone in agreement, basically. So if you've got all your leasehold neighbours to agree in writing that they were happy, and no one changed during the time it happened, and the freeholder was happy, you'd be all right.
Essentially, but if you've
still
got
not by letter of the law, is it?
No, it's not. But if you've got a large block of flats of say 20, 25 flats, that's impossible to get a letter from every single tenant to say that they're happy.
We don't generally buy in blocks because of this, because it is so difficult. I've got a building at the moment with 14 flats, 2 full houses, and that in itself is difficult. I think anything above like 5 or 6 people, and in London you always get one crazy or difficult person in every building, if not 2. So when you've got 40, you're going to get at least 4 nutters. And the landlords,
and the landlords are just not prepared to do it. They don't need that hassle. They're just not prepared to do it. So going back to what I was saying earlier, sometimes that's more of a plus for leaseholders to then buy the freeholders. So if they say 4 flats in the building, it means that they can then vary their leases, make them a little bit softer in terms of qualified covenants instead of absolute. But it has to still, what I say to clients is they say, oh, well, now we bought the freehold, we're going to change all the leases and allow everybody to do structural works. And I say, hang on a minute, think about this. You don't really want structural works to be allowed throughout.
So you're the one slowing it down on the other side.
Not necessarily, but I have to just say to the clients, you have to then think, a new buyer coming in, would they really want to buy a flat that allows the bottom floor, the top floor flat to do whatever they like? No, absolutely. Possibly not. Well, I wouldn't probably. You still need to have some... So you might have some variations to
change it possibly.
Yeah, you still need to have some level of
and I think whenever...
control over that.
No, it makes sense. I think whenever we're looking to buy a flat, and the first thing I do is ask for a lease before... often I agree the flat, and then I say, can I get the lease? Probably I should get it before, but often, as a developer, you want to protect that deal and push everyone away. So I'm more interested in securing the property, and then I've got time between then and exchange to figure out if there's an issue with the title. So that's why it's a bit the wrong way around. What I'm looking for in the lease is it says not to be unreasonably withheld or something to that effect, which basically gives you carte blanche as long as you do it properly to extend, as long as you own the demise and do what you want. So that's what we're looking for. And I would say probably 3/4 of the leases I see say that.
Yep.
And if they don't say that, I just think, this is another difficult one. But we recently bought a flat in Notting Hill where there was an absolute prohibition. I mentioned it in one of the other episodes, and we ended up, getting it changed.
Yeah.
And created a really amazing flat with an extension. So it can be done. So lease plans and how the impact works and what's notifiable, what isn't. We kind of touched on it earlier, didn't we? I think.
Yeah, we absolutely did. I think. Really, it has to reflect the current layout of the property. Otherwise, there could be major problems, especially when you come to sell the property. So if you sell the property and they say, hang on a minute, Ben, where's this hallway come from? It's just not going to work. Or they'll expect you...
It won't be mortgageable probably either, will it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Lenders will pick up on
defect. And they would need to make sure that they've either got a deed of variation confirming that hallway is included in the demise or whatever...
Can you indemnify against it?
I wouldn't.
You can, though, but it doesn't hold much weight.
But if I was the buyer coming in and the property is...
You'd advise against it.
You can absolutely take indemnity policy, but it also depends the appetite of the buyer as well. Yeah. What's he willing to...
There's always someone that will give you an indemnity for everything in this day and age, isn't there? I mean, they're so cheap normally, like 30 quid.
Not on the Duval case, you can't.
No, I know you can't.
That is literally the million... Yeah.
So one thing I think that is worth talking about as well is if you've got yourself as a leaseholder, the head leaseholder and the freeholder, or you could have multiple head leaseholders, no?
Correct.
In between you.
Absolutely,
and it's something that I have in my home in Lancaster Gate. We've got us as the leaseholder, and then we've also got the head leaseholder and the freeholder. And I've had to enter into a tripartite license to alter, which has cost me a lot more money because I've had to get the head leaseholder surveyor, the landlord surveyor. I've now got head leaseholder's consent, but I haven't got freeholder's consent. So now I'm trying to get that. Then we have to put it all together into a 3-way agreement. Mm-hmm. So costs escalate.
They do indeed. And I think if the lease, unfortunately, most of them do, say that you have to get the landlord's consent, which under the terms of your lease will be the head landlord, and superior landlord, which will then be the freeholder. So if your lease says that, then absolutely you have to get both both consents from the head leaseholder and the superior leaseholder. And unfortunately, that comes with costs. They're legal fees and surveyor's fees. And also it can, unfortunately, bring delays as well. Because not only have you got to wait for that surveyor to come back and report to their client, you've then got to wait for the other. Yeah, so it can be a bit of a nightmare.
I'm 15 months in since I completed on the flat. Mm-hmm. And I've had 2 plans. It's also listed, my flat. And I need planning because I'm building 4th floor level, extending. Not many people do 4th floor extensions on grade 2 listed houses in London, but I've managed to get the consent. But it's taken me 15 months and I still haven't got it. It's going to take me at least another 3 months. And you really have got to love what you're doing and really want to do the works because it will, from when I put the offer in, it took me a year to buy the flat because it was a probate. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And then I think by the time I start work, it's going to be 2.5 years from beginning to end. My other half is not at all happy about, we're living in like a 1970s, like horrible shithole of a flat, excuse my French. And my other half's not happy at all.
It'll be worth it once it's done.
Well, I do keep saying this, but I'm not sure. But Sam agrees. So that's interesting about having the tripartite agreement, and then doing works without consent. As you say, can cause massive issues on resale. It can become unmortgageable. Mm-hmm. Any other
It also
issues?
causes problems with lease extensions as well. So I've got a matter
Really?
at the moment, and the first thing the landlord solicitors would ask, we can see that there's been a variation to the lease plan because their surveyor will go around and carry out their valuation. So if they've got the lease plan here and they're going round and having a look at the lease in real terms, they can see if there's any structural changes, any walls that have been moved. So they will then invariably come back to us and say, where's the consent? And if my client hasn't got the consent, that can really cause
and
a
then
few issues.
then you need a retrospective license to alter,
Correct.
and they're invariably going to be difficult on that
Yes.
because they're going to be pissed off that you haven't done it properly.
Mm-hmm.
Surveyors will screw you down harder with what they want done because they're going to think, well, hang on a minute. For one, you can't see everything's been plastered over and painted, so you can't see whether they're probably going to ask you to do intrusive openings into structural. If you've done RSJs or whatever, they're going to want to see the pad stones to make sure they've been done properly. They're going to want to see calculations from an engineer. As a bare minimum, if you're going to do works without a license to alter, which you shouldn't do, make sure you get a building control inspector to oversee the works and get a structural engineer to oversee them, because at least then the two sort of most dangerous things about doing works without consent are kind of covered.
Absolutely.
But I would advise strongly against not doing it. I know loads of developers who don't get proper licenses and they still end up selling things, but cash buyers will buy them because they get a deal or whatever. But we always do things belt and braces by the book.
And it's the best way to be. Otherwise, it
100%.
can cause real headaches.
Yeah, we've talked a lot on this
future.
podcast about how developing is not just about the visual stuff you see. It's also about developing the paperwork, and a lot of that is getting the correct licenses, having the structural stuff and your calculations in place, building control, overseeing things, planning, listed building consent. It's a whole minefield. And I actually the other day drew up in the office to the guys in the office all the different stages that we have to go through before we can even start building, and there's like 7 or 8 things before we even get a quote. And they were quite shocked at like how much information is required, and in most cases we have to get all of it. So anyway, so now let's talk about Section 5 process, and this is, we've just done one of these together. So Section 5 process, what is it?
So essentially, it's an act called, it's the Landlord and Tenant Act, but it's called right of first refusal. Basically, what it means is that the freeholder can't sell the freehold of a building or part of a building. So, for example, if there's a communal hallway, I think that was the case that we possibly, or even airspace. So a lot of clients will come to me and say, oh, there's a roof terrace, I want to extend out on it. Oh, that should be fine. Can I start works? Absolutely no way. Airspace
unless it
above,
says you own it, which it doesn't. Unless
it says you demise, unless it's demised. But if it's not demised in terms of the lease, that airspace will belong to the freehold property. Will belong to the freehold.
And there's a lot of airspace deals at the moment being done.
Absolutely.
London's so tight on land.
Yeah, correct. So what that essentially means is the freeholder would need to serve what's called a Section 5 notice on all of the qualifying tenants in the building.
So all the leaseholders basically.
Yeah, and they will obviously put into the Section 5 a premium for that. So let's say we're talking about the airspace, for example. Let's say it's going to be 50,000. So
the developers offered 50,000, let's say.
50,000 in the Section 5 notice. That'll be
airspace.
served to all of the tenants. If the tenants are interested in buying the airspace,
To develop it themselves. Or
develop
to
it
extend their own
themselves.
flat, maybe.
Correct. What they have to do is they have to serve an acceptance notice, but it has to be the requisite majority. So if
More
you don't
than
get
50%.
Correct. So if you don't get the requisite majority, then they can't
do anything about it.
and buy the airspace.
I would think most 9 times out of 10 they don't do anything about it, because most people trying to get like 5 out of 10 to agree to spend 50 grand.
But also, if it's not connected to their flat or if they can't access it,
interest, is
it is just an academic process that you need to go through. But if the landlord doesn't do it, then it can be a criminal offence. I mean, I don't know any landlord that has had a criminal offence against them for it.
Can you imagine what you inside for, mate? I didn't serve Section 5. Oh, well, that sounds bad.
But it's written into statute that that is what it says.
Yeah, and we did it. We had to wait 2 months. In fact, we had to wait 2 months and 2 weeks because the freeholder surveyor actually said, because it was over Christmas, we had to wait an extra 2 weeks, which is annoying.
Gosh.
But we got there in the end, and it was agreed. And to be honest, even when the way that property works, even when things don't directly affect anyone, you can have someone on the ground floor and you're buying something on the upper floors. They will still be annoyed or get involved in the process. I don't really understand why, but that's the nature of people.
I think they don't really understand the process as well. So I think that really just comes down to being educated on how the process works. So if they think that they can stop you from buying that airspace if nobody else has come back with the acceptance notice, they don't understand it enough, so they still think they've got it right, although that period of time has finished. 2 months. If you want to serve your Section 6 notice, you can within the 2 months. If you haven't, then the landlord is free to dispose of that airspace to third party, another leaseholder.
And everyone always, and so they serve a Section 6 in return, like
Correct.
you say. The thing is as well, people always assume that when people sell properties and they get planning to build an extension, they're like, oh, my 500 grand house is worth 700 grand now. Well, it's not. The value as in development is really in the construction, because it's an absolute ball ache and it's hard. Material costs are going up, labour costs are shooting up. And often when I deal with neighbours, they just assume that spaces that aren't actually that valuable are suddenly worth hundreds of thousands. Now, if for example, I had a top floor flat that didn't have outside space and was a £2 million flat, if I could add a roof terrace to that flat, it would probably add 500,000 to value, because 75% as a plucked out the sky number of buyers at £2 million want outside space. So having a big lumpy unit on an upper floor, especially if there's no lift, the buyer pool is much smaller. So something like that actually has huge value. But just adding a smaller space, which is awkward in some way, which is what we've dealt with recently, the value uplift isn't that great. And you've also got to factor in the cost of, putting it all into place, doing the build work, the construction, and a room with 4 metre ceilings is obviously going to be worth more than a stairwell or whatever else you're buying. And I think, but a lot of people don't realise that. They just think, oh well, this is an expensive area, so you need to pay loads of money without working backwards from it. Fine, and I think before we go on to some real world examples of how we as a business have used leases and the various things around leases to capitalise and make money. What are the reforms that are up and coming? Because there's quite a few. Yeah,
absolutely. So the reforms, they're really trying to get these underway. So we have clients that come to us all the time saying, what's happening in the reforms? What's happening? Is there an update? When will these come into place? And the reforms are basically changing the whole leasehold enfranchisement structure. So what they're trying to do is eliminate any qualification rules, so you don't have to wait the 2 years. The standard extension will be 990 years, so no longer 90 years added on, it'll be 990 years. At the moment, there's almost a formula that surveyors use to assess what the premium's going to be. That is all going to be abolished, so I don't really know how that's going to work out with surveyors and going forward.
They're going to be unemployed.
Well,
hopefully not.
We don't know, but who knows what's going to happen.
If it's all just on a calculator and you can work it out, you don't need them. That's exactly what they're going to do.
The other massive thing that's going to cause real concern in the leasehold enfranchisement world is they're abolishing marriage value. And obviously we've spoken about that before. If your flat drops below 80 years, you have to pay that additional compensation. Well, if that's going to be abolished, then there will be no additional compensation. So that will have a massive impact on these big landlords, especially charity landlords.
People like Walden, all these major... I mean, just on that point, I know it's only going through Parliament.
Yeah.
There is going to be legal fight after legal fight on this, judicial reviews, whatever it's going to be. Because I just cannot see, especially with the Tories in power, I cannot see... There's so many rich landowners out there, all the big estates, Portman, Walden, they are going to lose potentially billions of pounds in premiums, and they're just going to fight it tooth and nail. So I think this could take years,
and that's exactly what we say to clients. So we have clients that come to us and say, my lease is 81 years, do I wait for the reforms?
No,
absolutely not. We can tell you about the reforms, and it's up to you to make that informed decision on what you want to do. But if you want my advice is just get that lease extended now. If you're waiting 5 years until it possibly might come in, you've already then gone on to the 80 years and you may be in a worse situation. So that's what we're really trying to tell clients, is that we can't really give you a time frame. We don't know. Nobody knows what's happening. The other interesting thing as well with the reforms, they're really trying to revamp the common hold again. How that's going to work, I don't know. But as it's kind of like fallen, they're really trying to look into it and really try to vamp it up.
I'm sure you're really excited about that.
I mean, I'm actually
you probably are, but most conveyancing lawyers won't be.
I'm actually really interested. No, I'm actually really interested to see how they're going to work on this community statement, how it's all going to look in practice. I think they're really trying to get a few bodies together to see how that would work.
Yeah. Makes sense. So lots of changes coming. And as I say, leases are a really good way. If you know what you're doing, you can really capitalise them and make money from them. If you know how to play them. And I think just to finish the podcast, it'd be good to talk about a couple of instances in which we've done that as a business and just give you some real world examples. So I'm going to talk first about Hamilton Terrace, which is the deal we've done recently. The flat was a probate. It was totally unmodernised, really. It had a 29-year lease when we put our offer in on it. It's a 1,900 square foot lateral flat with 4-metre ceilings and its own ballroom, which is, I've talked about it before, it's an incredible piece of real estate. By far the best thing I've ever bought in my career. And I had to pinch myself when we managed to buy it because I just couldn't believe we'd managed to get it. There was 8 or 9 developers trying to buy it, including some of the biggest hitters in northwest London. And somehow we managed to sneak in there and get it. And I was super proud of us as a business for doing that. But it had a lot of issues. It had a 29-year lease and it had good title. And there was also a head leaseholder and the charity as the freeholder. So we managed to finally agree the lease extension at £975,000. Most expensive lease extension I've ever done, which is a huge amount of money. Rebecca dealt with that along with our there was 2 small team I should say of surveyors that we dealt with. I think one left in the middle of it, probably from the stress of dealing with it. So Adrian and Jim, thank you for your help with that if they're listening. So we managed to extend the lease, and I also asked Rebecca to get absolute title, which you did. And we extended the lease by that point, it had gone down to 28 years. We extended it to 128 years. I think our fees in terms of all of the surveyors and legal fees are probably sat at like 25k. So it's £1 million lease extension. And yeah, do you think you want to say about that?
No, I'm just saying it was actually a really interesting one to do, and I really enjoyed working on that one. The solicitors. So what you find in leasehold enfranchisement is that the solicitors that deal with the big charities or the big landlords out there, you know them so well because we come up against them all the time. So you just know how the transaction is going to go, and because we've got such a good reputation in what we do, you know the people on the other side and you know how the transaction is going to go. So on this one, it was an absolute dream to work on because I knew them. So any changes that we wish to make to the leases, you can just pick up the phone and say, come on, let's see if we can try and agree this, let's work through. But added to the complexities of this one, you've again got the head lessor as well. So you've also got to make sure that they are in agreement with the changes that you want to make, because obviously they're very strict. It has to be on the same terms as existing lease, but only necessary or defects or any modifications that you wish to make must be absolutely reasonable.
And then after that, we were also running concurrently with that, doing originally it was a very complex license to alter. We actually changed our plans midway through because we were doing too much, and it was.
I don't think they liked some of the ideas.
Well, we were doing on the raised ground floor, doing major structural works. You've got flats above and below, when you need box frames and you've got to try and put a beam onto existing walls below. It's just a nightmare, and the temporary works to get there was a nightmare, and I just pulled at the plug on it. And it's very rare I change my mind once I make a decision, but it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
We kept the volume in the flat and got rid of the mezzanine that we were going to create. I think one thing, a little tip from me, is whenever I negotiate with anyone, whether it be buying a property or whether it be extending a lease, whatever it is, anything in life, you have to know your opposite number, rugby term, who you're up against. And I will do a lot of research. Whenever I'm doing a lease extension, I will Google who the company is, how much money they make, are they profitable, blah, 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 who are the directors. I literally will go through everything, because the more you know about the person you're negotiating with, the more you can play them and try and outmaneuver them. And with this particular lease extension, I knew that they were a charity. I found out when their year end was, which was in March. I called up my business partner. I said, look, the year end is March. I know they're a charity. Last year, they turned over, they made X amount from investments, which would obviously what the lease extensions were classed as, their premiums that they got from that. And I knew that our lease extension was about 15% of what they made last year on there. Wow. And so I said to Neil, my business partner, hope he doesn't mind mentioning his name, I said to him, I think we should try and drag this out a little bit, because I think at year end, they're going to want to do a deal with us, because although they're a charity, they're being run by a CEO who's being paid a lot of money, and he's got a board of trustees he's got to report back to. He's not going to want to take in less money than he did last year. I'm not saying that's why we got it agreed at the price we did, but I'm explaining the lengths we will go to as developers to try and outmaneuver the people we're negotiating with. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's like a sport, isn't it? So it's, you know, they've got their team, we've got our team. Absolutely. We're trying to beat them. Yeah. This is the fun. And to be honest, it's not about making money. Once you've been developing for a long time, it's not about making the money. It's actually about beating other people and outmanoeuvring them.
And having good specialists on your side. So
Exactly.
having the...
Like you.
I was actually going to say the valuers as well, having a very good valuer. So the valuers that you chose on this one, great reputation in the market. They know their stuff. They're very well known. And I think having good, reputable specialists like that is absolutely key to get a deal done.
Yeah. So that's my top tip. Really know your opposite number when you're negotiating. It could be anything. It could be something trivial. Just know who you're negotiating at and figure, because if you suddenly find out that someone you're negotiating against has just lost £500,000 in a business of theirs and they say, oh, we want 500 grand. Well, we've offered you 200. You can just say, well, no, we're offering you 200, take it or leave it, because you know that they need the money.
Yeah.
And that's business, isn't it? It's the name of the game. It might sound a bit heartless, but at the end of the day, they would do the same to you, and that's the business we're in, is to try and capitalise on these things. So, in terms of another deal that we did, that I think this was the first deal that you and I ever did together, was Linden Gardens.
Yes, we did.
We bought a first floor flat, just to set the scene. We bought a first floor flat in Linden Gardens, which was in a very poor state of repair. It was being sold by the executors of the freeholder, who owned the lease on it and the freehold to the whole building. Whenever I am buying something and the freeholder is the seller or their estate is the seller, I'm always rubbing my hands with joy, because you have the ability to get them to change things in the lease if it just affects your flat. Obviously, if it's in the hallways or whatever, you have to do a Section 5 process, as we've said. But it gives you the opportunity to say to them, for example, let's say a terrace isn't demised. You can't get it demised without Section 5, can you? But you can get sole usage of.
Correct.
And that's what we did.
Exclusive rights.
And in reality, if there's no development value in a roof terrace, an exclusive right to use it is just as valuable really as having it demised, because you can't build on most terraces at the front of a Grade 2 listed house in London.
Yeah, and it allows you the ability to use that just exclusively for your use.
And a lot of front balconies on Victorian townhouses in London are not demised. They were built as ornamental balconies, not to really be used.
Yeah.
That's why they're only like 2 feet high and very dangerous. You wouldn't want to drink on some of them. But we managed to do a number of things. So I'm just going to bring up a picture now of, as you can see, the property in Linden Gardens. And this is quite difficult for me to do because I can't actually see what's on the screen, but I remember the floor plans, luckily. So if you look at the before and after floor plans, this was a very unusual flat because we found there was a little strip of hallway at the back of the flat which was demised but wasn't physically connected to the main body of the flat. And then at the back there was a flat roof which had a door onto it, which again wasn't demised. But I knew that if that door had been there and it had been used as a terrace for more than 4 years, is that correct?
Yes.
Then there was nothing the council could do stopping us using it as a terrace. So I made just to put this into the speed at which we had to do this, I was in Thailand on holiday when I negotiated this entire deal. We did the whole deal in exchange in 3 days.
Amazing.
And I stipulated that I buy the flat for 975 on the basis that I got a license to alter in principle to be able to connect a stud wall from the flat itself to the terrace. I got a stat deck saying that they'd used the terrace for like 20 years, so that I had it covered from a planning perspective. And then I got them to allow sole usage of front terrace, rear terrace. And then so when I completed on the purchase, I had full license to alter. I had 2 terraces that weren't there before, and we had a flat that was larger.
Yeah.
And
great result.
If you have a look at the plans that are on the screen now, we created a study at the back which linked the terrace to the main flat. We then we wouldn't, as soon as we created the terrace, all the neighbours around rang the council. We got literally like 10 neighbours ringing the council because they all want a terrace, they can't have it. I knew we'd obviously played the system, but we'd done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
We just knew what we were doing. So we did that. Anyway, the council came round. I put all planters around the terrace to make it safer. And the council said, well, you haven't got planning. And I said, well, I don't need it because this has been a terrace for years. So they came round and they said, well, we can't do anything about it. You know perfectly well we can't. I said, well, I know you can't. I said, can I just get that in writing? So they sent it. I've talked about this on the other podcast, but now we're talking about it again. I might as well say it again. So they sent a letter out saying, you shouldn't have this terrace, but we can't do anything about it. So I knew that as soon as I had it in writing, when I came to sell it, I could get over that hump and get it away with the buyer. And this is the key. You have to know what lenders and buyers need to be able to make purchases. This is the key to being a successful developer. You have to know. And the longer you do it, the more you can push the boundaries within the law to do things legally. But you can make ways of making money that are totally allowable. But you have to make sure you have the right paperwork to back it up.
Yeah.
And if you don't, you get stuck. And so in the end, we created this flat. We had a 200 square foot with a mezzanine. We had a rear terrace, front terrace. Very rare to get front and rear terraces on flats in London. And we bought it for 975, sold it for 1.62. And then Becky did the collective enfranchisement, and we bought the freehold.
Correct.
Which took ages.
Yes, it does, unfortunately. That is the statutory process. But yes, but it was a great result at the end of it. So, yeah.
And then we refurbished the building. So we tend to refurbish buildings that we buy, and we tend to leave them in a better state than when we turn up. So yeah, everyone was happy. The other tenants were happy there in the freehold. They had a nice house, and we were happy because we'd made good profit, and it was a great project. And it's actually, if you look at if you go online and look at our past deals, knightjames.co.uk, you can go on to Linden Gardens. You can see the mezzanine we created. We did a walk-on glass study, which is really cool. It's a really cool flat, and it's actually now being rented out as like a really high-end Airbnb. They get like 400 quid a night for it. So they're really happy.
Really good result. Wow.
So yeah, so I think that's two examples of how we've used it to capitalise on things. Just to finish off, Becky, best things you've learned in the property game that you would advise people?
I would say keeping abreast of what's going on, the law, because we get so many questions about it. So it's giving your clients the confidence that you are aware of what's happening as well. I think that's absolutely vital. And I would say, cringe I know, but I would say know your client. So if a client comes to you and they want to sell the property on, but then they want to do all of these things to the property, you then need to just have a conversation with your client. Say, is it worth you carrying out all these alterations or whatever you want to do when the end goal is that you want to sell the property and you've already got a buyer lined up? So I think it's really having a rapport with your client and actually understanding what their end goal is. What do they actually want out of this transaction?
Yeah.
And just trying to make sure that you're guiding them in the right way possible, or giving them that advice that makes sense to them of what they want to achieve at the end of it.
Fine. Rebecca Rinn, thank you very much. If people want to get hold of you, if anyone's looking for a really shit hot leasehold specialist lawyer,
thank you.
Then Becky's definitely your first port of call. So how would they get hold of you?
You can go to the website, which is on Streathers, or you can email me at Rebecca Rinn.
Yep. Double N.
Yes, RINN at streathers.co.uk, and all of my details are on the Streathers website.
Yeah, use the code BenWilson1 for 10% off at the checkout. Definitely you won't be getting a discount. But Becky, thank you very much. In all seriousness, you've been an amazing guest, and I'm sure people will get a lot from it.
Great, thank you very much for having me.